Did you ever wonder where all that deep, ancient knowledge came from? How did people in the Middle Ages, with no internet or even printing presses, manage to build entire worlds of ideas? What incredible treasure troves held the secrets of medicine, astronomy, law, and faith from 500 C to 1500 C. Number 1. The Imperial Library of Constantinople. The city of Constantinople, a shining jewel perched between two continents, stood as the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years. It was a place of soaring domes, intricate mosaics, and a constant hum of trade and intellectual pursuit. Right in the heart of this vibrant metropolis, nestled within the imperial palace complex or in grand structures nearby, sat the Imperial Library of Constantinople. This was not just a dusty collection of scrolls. It was a living, breathing hub of learning, a fortress built not of stone but of parchment and ink, guarding the wisdom of centuries. Its origins stretched back to the very beginnings of the empire itself, possibly even to the days of Constantine the Great in the 4th century. Later, Emperor Theodosius II, in the 5th century, put a significant effort into organizing and expanding the library, even employing professional scribes to copy and preserve texts. He understood that knowledge was power, and a well-preserved past meant a stronger future for the empire. The library was a sprawling complex, likely composed of several rooms or even wings, each dedicated to different subjects or languages. Imagine high ceilings, perhaps painted with scenes of ancient philosophers or geometric patterns, and sturdy wooden shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. The air would carry the subtle scent of old parchment, beeswax, and perhaps a faint hint of incense from nearby churches. Light filtered through tall, arched windows, illuminating the intricate details of illuminated manuscripts. Scholars, scribes, and theologians would move through these spaces with a quiet reverence, their voices hushed as they consulted weighty tomes. This was a place where Greek thought, Roman law, and Christian theology met and mingled, creating a unique intellectual tapestry. The core of the collection was deeply rooted in ancient Greek literature and philosophy. Copies of Homer's epic poems, the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, and the philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle were all meticulously preserved here. These were not just curiosities, they were textbooks, sources of inspiration, and foundations for new thought. Beyond the classics, the library housed an immense collection of Christian theological texts. The writings of the Church Fathers, the voluminous commentaries on Scripture, and the records of church councils were all carefully cataloged and stored. This was crucial for maintaining the doctrinal purity of Orthodox Christianity, which was central to the Byzantine identity. Legal codes, like the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis compiled under Emperor Justinian I, were also vital components of the collection. This collection of Roman law profoundly influenced legal systems across Europe for centuries, and copies held within the Imperial Library were invaluable for administrators and jurists throughout the empire. Scientific treatises, particularly in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, also found a home here. Byzantine scholars were keen observers of the natural world and heirs to Greek scientific traditions. They preserved texts by Hippocrates, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy, studying and sometimes adding their own commentaries to these foundational works. The process of creating and maintaining the collection was a laborious one. Scribes, often monks or educated clerks, dedicated their lives to copying texts by hand. They would sit for hours, meticulously forming each letter with quills made from goose feathers, using ink made from gallnuts and lamp black. Parchment, made from animal skins, was prepared with great care to ensure a smooth, durable surface. Some manuscripts were richly illuminated, adorned with vibrant miniature paintings and intricate decorative borders, making them not just sources of information but works of art. The emperors themselves were often patrons of this scribal work, commissioning new copies of texts, or sending out agents to acquire rare books from other lands. They understood that a vast library was a symbol of imperial prestige and a tool for intellectual dominance. Many significant scholars worked within or drew upon the resources of the Imperial Library. Photios, a brilliant patriarch in the 9th century, was a true intellectual giant. He authored the Myriad Biblon, a massive collection of summaries and reviews of over 200 books he had read, many of which would otherwise be lost to history. This work provides an invaluable glimpse into the intellectual landscape of his time and highlights the incredible breadth of the library's holdings. Michael Sellos, an 11th century polymath, was another luminary. He taught philosophy, rhetoric, and law, and his writings drew heavily on the classical texts preserved in the library, demonstrating a vibrant intellectual engagement with the past. The library was not just a storage facility. It was an active educational institution, a place where students could learn from the masters and delve into primary sources. The library's influence extended far beyond the walls of Constantinople. It served as a beacon of learning during what was often called the Dark Ages in Western Europe. While much of the West struggled to preserve even basic literacy, Byzantium maintained a sophisticated intellectual tradition, largely thanks to institutions like the Imperial Library. During various periods, especially after the Crusades, Latin scholars from the West would visit Constantinople and marvel at its literary treasures. They would often commission copies of Greek texts, which then made their way back to Western Europe, eventually fueling the Renaissance. The library acted as a vital bridge between the classical world and the modern era, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have vanished forever. The fate of the Imperial Library was intertwined with the turbulent history of Constantinople itself. It suffered greatly during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Latin crusaders sacked the city with brutal efficiency. Many precious manuscripts were destroyed, looted, or dispersed. Eyewitness accounts speak of the wanton destruction, with books being torn apart for their valuable covers, or simply discarded. Despite this devastating blow, the Byzantines attempted to rebuild and restore their intellectual heritage in the centuries that followed, but the library never fully regained its former glory. When the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453, the remaining collections faced an uncertain future. While some manuscripts were undoubtedly lost or destroyed, others were preserved in Ottoman hands or had already been spirited away by scholars and refugees to Western Europe, particularly Italy. Thus, while the Imperial Library of Constantinople as a physical entity ceased to exist, its legacy, through the countless texts it preserved and disseminated, continues to shape our understanding of the ancient world and the medieval era. It reminds us that knowledge is a fragile flame, needing constant care and protection across generations. Number 2. The University of Paris Library. Paris, a sprawling medieval city of winding streets, towering cathedrals, and bustling markets, became one of the most important intellectual centers of Europe by the 13th century. At its heart, a new kind of institution was taking shape: the university. The University of Paris, often simply called the Sorbonne after one of its famous colleges, was not just a collection of teachers and students. It was a vibrant community of scholars attracting minds from across the continent. Central to this intellectual ferment was its library, not a single grand edifice like some imperial collections, but a decentralized network of libraries belonging to various colleges, faculties, and religious orders within the university structure. The main university library itself grew from modest beginnings, driven by the sheer need for books among an ever-increasing student body and faculty. The development of the University of Paris Library was different from the monastic or imperial libraries. It was driven by curriculum and scholastic method. Students and masters needed access to a wide range of texts for lectures, disputations, and personal study. The traditional monastic scriptoria, while important, could not keep up with the demand. Books in Paris were not just for preservation, they were tools for active intellectual engagement, for debate and critical analysis. The very air in the university quarters would have hummed with intellectual energy, the sound of Latin arguments spilling from lecture halls, the scratching of quills and the rustle of parchment as students pored over their texts. The colleges, like the famous Sorbonne, each had their own libraries, often quite substantial, serving the specific needs of their residents. These libraries were not open to just anyone. Access was usually restricted to members of the college or faculty. Books were valuable commodities, often chained to desks to prevent theft, a common practice in medieval university libraries. Types of texts found in the University of Paris libraries reflected the core disciplines taught there. Theology reigned supreme. Works by the Church Fathers such as Augustine and Jerome, alongside the massive compilations of Peter Lombard's sentences, formed the backbone of theological study. The groundbreaking works of scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, who taught at Paris, were also central. Their intricate arguments about faith and reason, God and creation, required deep textual engagement. Philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, newly translated from Greek and Arabic into Latin, became increasingly important. These texts were revolutionary for Western thought, introducing new ways of thinking about logic, ethics, and the natural world. Masters and students devoured Aristotle's metaphysics, ethics, and on the soul, using them as foundations for their own intellectual inquiries. Law was another prominent faculty. Roman law, based on Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, and canon law, the law of the church, were extensively studied. Students would pore over massive legal commentaries and collections of papal decrees, preparing for careers in church administration or secular government. Medicine, while not as dominant as theology or law, also had its own faculty and library holdings, including works by ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, alongside texts from Arabic medical tradition. The acquisition of books for these university libraries was a complex process. Donations from wealthy patrons, former students, or professors were a major source. A scholar, upon retirement or death, might bequeath his entire personal collection to his college. Books were also purchased from professional scribes and stationers who clustered around the university. Unlike monastic scriptoria, which copied for internal use, these urban scribes operated on a commercial basis, producing multiple copies of required textbooks. They often employed a picia system, where a master copy of a text was divided into sections or piciae, and different scribes would copy different sections simultaneously, speeding up production. This made books more accessible, though still expensive for the university community. The university statutes often dictated which books were required for certain courses, ensuring a standardized curriculum. Many influential figures studied or taught at the University of Paris and made use of its libraries. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar, whose Summa Theologica became one of the most important works of Western theology, spent significant time teaching and writing in Paris. His work, heavily influenced by Aristotle, showed the power of combining classical philosophy with Christian doctrine, a synthesis made possible by the accessible texts within the university's libraries. Bonaventure, another prominent Franciscan theologian, also taught at Paris, contributing significantly to mystical theology. Roger Bacon, the English Franciscan friar and philosopher, despite facing some controversy, pushed for empirical observation and drew on a vast array of texts, including those on optics and alchemy likely found in the university's more specialized collections. John Gerson, chancellor of the university in the early 15th century, was a key figure in the Great Schism and a proponent of church reform, using the theological and legal resources of the library to articulate his positions. The University of Paris and its libraries played a critical role in the intellectual and religious life of medieval Europe. It was a crucible where new ideas were forged, debated, and disseminated. It trained generations of scholars, lawyers, theologians, and administrators who went on to shape the intellectual landscape of kingdoms and the church. The scholastic method, emphasizing logical argument and systematic inquiry, was honed within its walls, influencing intellectual discourse for centuries. The university also served as a major center for the production of Latin manuscripts, directly impacting the availability of books across Europe. Its reputation drew students from as far away as England, Germany, and Italy, making it a truly international center of learning. The university libraries, while surviving better than some others through conflict, still faced challenges. Fire, neglect, and political turmoil could take their toll. The French Revolution in the late 18th century eventually led to the dissolution of many individual college libraries, their collections being confiscated and absorbed into what would become the Bibliothèque nationale de France, the National Library of France. This marked the end of the decentralized, college-specific library system of medieval Paris. However, the legacy of the University of Paris Library lies in its role as a forge for scholastic thought, a clearinghouse for newly translated classical and Arabic texts, and a vital engine for the production and dissemination of knowledge during a joking period in European intersexual history. It represents the shift from monastic learning to a more urban, professionalized scholarship. Number 3. The Papal Library, Vatican Library, predecessor. Rome, the Eternal City, for centuries served as the spiritual heart of Western Christendom, the seat of the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. While the modern Vatican Library with its vast Renaissance halls might be what first comes to mind, its origins stretch back deep into the medieval period. Papal Library, in its various forms throughout the Middle Ages, was not a static entity but a collection that grew and evolved with the fortunes and needs of the papacy. It was not always housed in a single grand building. Often it consisted of collections scattered across various papal palaces, administrative offices, and even the personal libraries of popes themselves. Yet, its purpose remained constant: to serve the administrative, theological, and scholarly needs of the Roman Church. The earliest traces of a papal library can be found in the 4th century, even before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. As the Church grew in power and influence, so did its need for documents, records, and theological texts. These early collections were primarily administrative, housing papal letters, decrees, and records of councils. They also included foundational Christian texts, such as versions of the Bible, commentaries, and the writings of early church fathers like Ambrose and Gregory the Great. The emphasis on canon law, the law of the Church, became increasingly significant as the papacy asserted its authority across Europe. The Lateran Palace, the primary residence of the popes for much of the Middle Ages, would have housed the most important parts of this collection. Imagine clerks and scribes meticulously organizing scrolls and codices in crowded chambers, the air thick with the scent of parchment and the low murmur of Latin. Through the early medieval period, the papal library suffered from various sackings of Rome, particularly by the Goths and Vandals, and later by the Normans. Each period of upheaval meant losses and dispersion of texts. However, the collection was continually rebuilt and replenished, reflecting the Church's resilience. By the High Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th century onwards, the papal library began to take on a more robust scholarly character, not just administrative. Popes like Innocent III and Gregory IX, both legal scholars, would have relied heavily on its resources for their extensive legal pronouncements and theological arguments. The move of the papacy to Avignon in the 14th century, during the Avignon papacy, saw a significant expansion and organization of the library there. The Avignon popes, particularly John XXII and Clement VI, were major patrons of learning. Their library in Avignon grew to an impressive size, containing thousands of volumes, far more than previous papal collections. It was carefully catalogued, with entries describing each book, its contents, and its estimated value. This library reflected the breadth of papal interests, including not only theology and canon law, but also history, philosophy, classical literature, and even some scientific texts. When the papacy returned to Rome in the late 14th century, the Avignon collection was eventually transferred back, albeit in stages and with some losses. The subsequent popes, particularly during the early Renaissance, continued to expand the library. Figures like Nicholas V, a true humanist in the mid-15th century, made a concerted effort to systematically acquire texts, including Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, reflecting the growing intellectual curiosity of the age. He envisioned a comprehensive collection that would encompass all branches of human knowledge. This period marked a crucial transition towards the modern Vatican Library. He sent agents across Europe to seek out and purchase rare manuscripts, employing skilled scribes to copy them. He also hired scholars to translate Greek texts into Latin, making ancient knowledge accessible to Western European readers. The very walls of the papal palace, like the Vatican, would have been increasingly filled with books, testament to the value placed on written knowledge. The types of texts in the papal library were incredibly diverse. Of course, theological works formed the undisputed core. Multiple versions of the Bible, biblical commentaries, the writings of all the major church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, Gregory the Great, etc. The decrees of church councils, and the voluminous works of scholastic theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure. Canon law was another immense category, with collections of papal bulls, decretals, and legal commentaries essential for the functioning of the Church. But beyond these, the library also housed classical Latin authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Seneca, whose works were studied for their style and moral wisdom. As translations from Greek became more common, philosophical works by Plato and Aristotle were added, alongside histories by Livy and Tacitus. Medical texts, astronomical treatises, and even some works on mathematics or natural philosophy were also present, reflecting the intellectual curiosity of some popes and their advisors. The papal library served multiple crucial functions. It was the central archive for the vast administrative machinery of the Roman Curia, holding records that stretched back centuries. It was a resource for theological debate, providing the definitive versions of texts for interpreting doctrine. It supported the training of canon lawyers and papal diplomats. It was a symbol of papal authority and intellectual prestige, demonstrating the Church's commitment to learning and its role as a preserver of knowledge. Scholars from across Europe would sometimes travel to Rome or Avignon, seeking access to specific rare texts or to consult with papal scholars. The library was a repository of knowledge that could be deployed in theological arguments, political negotiations, and doctrinal pronouncements. The papal library's ultimate fate was its continuous evolution into the Vatican Apostolic Library we know today. Unlike many medieval libraries that were destroyed or dispersed, the papal collection, despite periods of loss and upheaval, was largely maintained and expanded. Its continuous existence makes it one of the oldest functioning libraries in the world, directly tracing its lineage back to the earliest collections of the popes. Current magnificent building in the Vatican City was largely completed in the late 16th century, providing a permanent home for the collection that had once been spread across various palaces. Papal Library, therefore, stands as a testament to the enduring power of knowledge and the Church's long-standing commitment to preserving and cultivating intellectual pursuits, a beacon for scholars through centuries of change and conflict. Number 4. The Library of Cordoba, Umayyad Caliphate. In the 10th century, while much of Western Europe was still recovering from the collapse of the Roman Empire, the city of Cordoba, in Islamic Spain or Al-Andalus, shone with a dazzling brilliance. It was the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, a city of exquisite architecture, bustling markets, and an intellectual vibrancy that put many European centers to shame. Cordoba boasted paved streets, street lighting, and public baths long before they were common in the West. And at the heart of this thriving metropolis stood a library that was legendary in its scope and scale, a true wonder of the medieval world. This was the Library of Cordoba, founded and continually expanded by the Umayyad Caliphs, most notably Abd al-Rahman III and his son al-Hakam II. It was not merely a collection of books, it was a testament to the Islamic world's profound reverence for learning and its unparalleled commitment to the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge. The library's origins lay in the personal collections of the early Umayyad rulers, who were passionate about scholarship. However, it was Caliph al-Hakam II who reigned from 961 to 976, who transformed it into an institution of unprecedented size and importance. Al-Hakam II was a polymath himself, deeply knowledgeable in many fields, and he dedicated immense resources to the library. He employed an army of agents to travel across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cairo, seeking out and purchasing rare manuscripts. He also commissioned an army of scribes, copyists, and bookbinders to produce new copies of texts. The sheer volume of books was staggering. Some accounts, though perhaps exaggerated, speak of hundreds of thousands of volumes, possibly even reaching 400,000 or more. Even if the numbers are lower, it was undoubtedly one of the largest libraries in the world at the time, dwarfing any contemporary collection in Christian Europe. The physical description of the library would have been awe-inspiring. Imagine spacious halls, perhaps adorned with intricate geometric patterns or calligraphic verses, and well lit by sunlight streaming through arched windows. The books themselves would have been beautifully bound, some in fine leather, others adorned with gold leaf. They were not typically chained, as was common in Europe, reflecting a different cultural approach to their accessibility. The air would be fragrant with the scent of paper, ink, and perhaps exotic spices carried in on the breeze from the nearby markets. The librarians and scholars, likely dressed in fine robes, would move with a quiet dignity, their hands accustomed to the weight of precious tomes. Cordoba had a vibrant paper-making industry, having learned the craft from the East, which made books more accessible than the expensive parchment used in Europe. The range of subjects covered in the Library of Cordoba was incredibly broad, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of Islamic scholarship. Foremost were texts on Islamic sciences, the Quran and its commentaries, tafsir, hadith collections, sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, Islamic law, fiqh, and Arabic grammar and linguistics. Critically, the library was a powerhouse of secular learning. Philosophy, particularly the works of ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and Neoplatonists, were extensively studied, often through Arabic translations. Mathematics and astronomy were central, with texts by Euclid, Ptolemy, and Indian mathematicians, alongside the grounding original works of Islamic scholars like al-Khwarizmi, whose work laid the foundation for algebra. Medicine was another strong suit, with translations of Hippocrates and Galen, alongside the works of influential Islamic physicians like al-Razi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna. These texts often contained practical knowledge derived from extensive clinical experience. History, geography, and even poetry and literature were also richly represented. The library also held works on agriculture, engineering, and other practical sciences, reflecting the application of knowledge to daily life. Many influential scholars were associated with the Library of Cordoba, either as users, contributors, or patrons. Al-Hakam II himself was not just a patron, but an active scholar, often annotating books with his own comments. The famous physician and philosopher Ibn Rushd, Averroes, though living slightly later, was deeply rooted in the intellectual tradition that the Cordoban library fostered. His commentaries on Aristotle became hugely influential in both the Islamic world and later in Christian Europe. Although he likely worked in later Andalusian libraries, the intellectual foundation he built upon was established by institutions like Cordoba's. Other scholars, many of whose names are not widely known in the West, dedicated their lives to translating, copying, and writing within its sphere of influence. They contributed to the vibrant intellectual life that made Cordoba famous. The Library of Cordoba's impact was immense. It was a major center for translation, where Greek, Latin, and Syriac texts were rendered into Arabic, preserving and disseminating knowledge that was often lost or forgotten in the West. This active translation movement was crucial for the transmission of ancient learning. It attracted scholars and students from across the Islamic world and beyond, making Cordoba a leading intellectual hub. The knowledge preserved and advanced in Cordoba directly contributed to the flourishing of Islamic science, philosophy, and medicine. Moreover, through intellectual exchange, often involving Jewish and Christian scholars living within Al-Andalus, this knowledge eventually made its way into Christian Europe. Latin scholars, keen to rediscover ancient Greek learning, would journey to places like Toledo and Cordoba, translating Arabic texts, which were often translations of Greek texts, into Latin. This process played a significant role in sparking the intellectual awakening of the 12th century Renaissance in Europe. The glorious reign of the Library of Cordoba, however, was not destined to last forever. Its decline was largely due to the political instability and fragmentation of the Umayyad Caliphate. In the early 11th century, Cordoba suffered from civil war and internal strife, leading to its sack in 1009 to 1010. During this period of intense conflict, much of the library's collection was destroyed or dispersed. Fanatical religious factions who viewed some of the philosophical and scientific texts as heretical actively participated in burning books. It was a tragic loss, reducing one of the world's greatest repositories of knowledge to ashes and scattered remnants. While some books were undoubtedly saved or had already been copied and disseminated, the physical collection of the Library of Cordoba effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. Its legacy, however, lives on through the intellectual currents it set in motion, the ideas it preserved, and the scholarship it fostered, which continue to resonate in the history of science and philosophy. Number 5. The Abbey of Monte Cassino Library. Perched atop a rugged hill overlooking the Liri Valley in central Italy, the Abbey of Monte Cassino stands as one of the most enduring symbols of monasticism in the Western world. Founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia himself in 529 CE, it became the birthplace of the Benedictine order and a powerful force in shaping medieval European culture. From its very inception, the community at Monte Cassino understood the profound importance of books. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational guide for monastic life, emphasized the value of reading and study, setting aside specific times for spiritual reading, Lectio Divina. This spiritual imperative translated into a practical need for a library, and over centuries, Monte Cassino built a collection that became a beacon of learning in a tumultuous age. It was a place where knowledge was not just preserved, but actively cultivated and disseminated. The library at Monte Cassino was not just a room full of books. It was a scriptorium, a place where manuscripts were painstakingly copied, illuminated, and bound. Imagine a quiet hall, perhaps with individual carrels or desks near windows, allowing natural light to fall upon the parchment. The scratching of quills, the rustle of leaves, and the low murmurs of monks consulting texts would be the dominant sounds. The scent of ink, parchment, and beeswax from candles would permeate the air. The monks saw their work as scribes, as an act of devotion, a way to serve God by preserving His word and the wisdom of the ancients. Collections started with religious texts, multiple copies of the Bible, commentaries on Scripture by the Church Fathers like Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and Gregory the Great, liturgical books and theological treatises. The Rule of Saint Benedict itself was, of course, central. These texts were essential for the daily life of the monastery, for prayer, study, and the spiritual nourishment of the community. However, Monte Cassino's library became renowned for more than just its religious texts. From its early days, the monks also made a deliberate effort to collect and copy classical pagan works. Saint Benedict's own background was one of learning, and he likely valued the practical wisdom found in ancient authors. As such, copies of Roman authors like Virgil, Horace, Livy, and Seneca found their way into the library. These classical texts were studied not just for their literary style, but also for their historical and philosophical insights. The monastery became a crucial link in the transmission of classical knowledge to the early medieval period, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They also collected works on grammar, rhetoric, and logic, forming the basis of the liberal arts curriculum. One of the most remarkable periods for the Monte Cassino library was during the abbacy of Desiderius, who later became Pope Victor III in the 11th century. Under his leadership, the scriptorium experienced a massive revival. Desiderius commissioned numerous new copies of classical and theological texts, often sending agents across Italy to acquire rare manuscripts. He fostered an environment of intense intellectual activity, attracting talented scribes and artists to the abbey. The manuscripts produced during this period are renowned for their beauty, intricate illuminations, and scholarly accuracy. They reflect a sophisticated artistic and intellectual culture, demonstrating that learning was thriving in unexpected corners of Europe. The monks also engaged in original scholarship, writing histories, chronicles, and commentaries. Many significant texts were either preserved or produced at Monte Cassino. The oldest manuscript of Tacitus's Annals, a foundational work of Roman history, was preserved there. Early versions of medical texts by Hippocrates and Galen were also held in its collection, showing an interest in practical sciences. The abbey also played a key role in the development of liturgical music, with its monks copying and preserving early forms of Gregorian chant. The library was a resource for theological debate and for the administrative needs of the monastic order as it spread across Europe, provided a foundation for the legal studies necessary for the running of a large monastic network. The impact of Monte Cassino was profound and multifaceted. It served as a spiritual model for thousands of other monasteries, founded across Europe, carrying with it the Benedictine emphasis on stability, work, and prayer, which crucially included reading and study. As other monasteries adopted the Benedictine rule, they too established scriptoria and libraries, spreading the practice of book production and preservation. Monte Cassino acted as a cultural and intellectual refuge during centuries of political instability and invasions. Its monks were not just isolated scholars, they were active participants in the intellectual life of their time, corresponding with other learned individuals and monasteries. The knowledge preserved and disseminated from Monte Cassino helped lay the groundwork for later intellectual revivals, contributing significantly to what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries, and the larger intellectual movements. Monte Cassino's history, however, is marked by repeated destruction and rebuilding. The abbey was sacked by the Lombards in 577 CE, forcing the monks to flee to Rome and taking some of their precious books with them. It was later rebuilt. It was again destroyed by Saracens in 883 CE, leading to another period of loss and displacement. Yet, each time, the community returned and painstakingly rebuilt its library, demonstrating an extraordinary dedication to its mission. Even in World War II, the abbey suffered devastating bombing in 1944. Before the destruction, however, the monks, with the help of the German military, managed to evacuate most of the priceless manuscripts and artworks to safety in Rome. This remarkable act of preservation highlights the enduring value placed on the library's contents, even in times of brutal conflict. Though the physical buildings have been destroyed and rebuilt many times, the spirit of scholarship and preservation at Monte Cassino has continued, ensuring that its legacy as a guardian of knowledge remains unchallenged. Number 6. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, in Baghdad. Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, rose in the 8th century to become one of the largest, wealthiest, and most intellectually vibrant cities in the world. It was a crucible of cultures, drawing scholars, merchants, and ideas from across the known world, from China to Spain. In the heart of this city of peace, around the 9th century, a legendary institution took shape: the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah. This was far more than just a library. It was a grand academy, a translation center, a research institute, and an observatory, all rolled into one. It represented the pinnacle of the Islamic Golden Age's intellectual aspirations, an ambitious project to gather, translate, and advance all human knowledge. The House of Wisdom was largely established and heavily patronized by the Abbasid caliphs, most notably Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun, reigning from 813 to 833 CE, was a particularly avid patron of learning, reportedly offering the weight of the books in gold as a reward for successful translations. He understood that knowledge was a source of power and prestige for his caliphate. The institution was likely housed in a magnificent building, possibly with multiple wings or sections, each dedicated to different disciplines. Imagine large, airy rooms filled with scribes working diligently, scholars engaged in intense debate, and astronomers observing the night sky from a rooftop observatory. The air would be filled with the quiet rustle of paper, the scratching of reeds on parchment, and the murmuring of multiple languages as translators worked between Greek, Syriac, Persian, Sanskrit, and Arabic. The core activity of the House of Wisdom was translation. It attracted scholars from diverse backgrounds and faiths, including Christians, Jews, and Persians, all working together to render ancient texts into Arabic. They were particularly keen on Greek works: Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's treatises on logic, metaphysics, ethics, and natural philosophy, and the medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen were all meticulously translated. Mathematical works by Euclid and Archimedes, and astronomical treatises by Ptolemy were similarly brought into Arabic. But the translation effort also extended to Persian and Sanskrit texts, including Indian mathematical concepts that brought numerical zero and the decimal system to the Islamic world. This monumental translation movement ensured that the knowledge of ancient civilizations, much of which had been lost or was inaccessible in Western Europe, was preserved and made available to a new generation of scholars. Beyond translation, the House of Wisdom was a center for original scholarship and research. Scholars working there made groundbreaking advancements in numerous fields. In mathematics, Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us algorithm, developed algebra, writing the seminal text, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. He also introduced Indian numerals and the decimal system to the Islamic world, which later spread to Europe. In astronomy, scholars at the House of Wisdom meticulously observed celestial bodies, corrected Ptolemy's models, and compiled accurate astronomical tables. They developed sophisticated instruments and improved understanding of planetary motion. In medicine, physicians not only translated ancient texts, but also conducted empirical research, dissecting bodies, identifying diseases, and developing new treatments. Figures like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian scholar, was a master translator and also a physician, writing extensively on ophthalmology. The library itself was immense, housing hundreds of thousands of volumes, reflecting the vast output of the translation movement and original scholarship. It would have contained a comprehensive collection of texts on Islamic sciences, Quranic studies, Hadith law, alongside the translated Greek, Persian, and Indian works. Books on history, geography, optics, mechanics, and even alchemy were also part of the collection. The availability of paper, a technology introduced to the Islamic world from China, played a crucial role in the House of Wisdom's productivity. Paper was far cheaper and easier to produce than parchment, allowing for the creation of many more copies of texts and facilitating the spread of knowledge. The House of Wisdom drew scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond. It fostered an environment of intellectual curiosity, rigorous debate, and climate research. Its scholars were not afraid to question existing knowledge, to refine theories, and to make new discoveries. The institution's impact on the Islamic world was immense, fueling the golden age of Islamic science and philosophy. It led to advancements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and optics that significantly shaped human knowledge for centuries. The knowledge produced and translated in Baghdad eventually found its way to Islamic Spain, and from there, through scholars and traders, it gradually permeated Western Europe, particularly during the 12th century translation movement in Toledo. This transmission of knowledge, directly facilitated by institutions like the House of Wisdom, laid much of the groundwork for the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The glorious era of the House of Wisdom, however, came to a tragic end. In 1258, the Mongol armies under Hulagu Khan besieged and sacked Baghdad with unimaginable ferocity. The city was utterly devastated, its inhabitants massacred, and its cultural treasures destroyed. According to contemporary accounts, the House of Wisdom was razed, its vast library collection thrown into the Tigris River until the river ran black with ink from the dissolving manuscripts and red with the blood of scholars. This act of barbaric destruction marked a catastrophic loss for human knowledge, destroying centuries of accumulated wisdom in a single brutal event. While some texts undoubtedly survived or had already been copied and disseminated to other parts of the Islamic world, the House of Wisdom, as a physical institution and a unified collection, ceased to exist. Its legacy, however, is a powerful testament to the intellectual achievements of the Islamic Golden Age and its enduring contribution to the global heritage of knowledge. Number 7. The Abbey of Cluny Library. In the early 10th century, in the heart of Burgundy, France, a new monastic order emerged that would profoundly influence the spiritual, political, and intellectual landscape of medieval Europe. The Abbey of Cluny. Founded in 910 CE by Duke William, the first of Aquitaine, Cluny quickly grew in prestige and power, becoming the head of a vast network of hundreds of daughter houses and priories spread across France, England, Spain, and Italy. Unlike many other monastic foundations, Cluny enjoyed an unprecedented level of independence from secular lords and even bishops, answering directly to the Pope. This freedom allowed it to maintain strict adherence to the Benedictine rule and to become a leading center of monastic reform, religious life, and crucially intellectual activity centered around its magnificent library. The monastic life at Cluny, like all Benedictine houses, placed a strong emphasis on prayer, manual labor, and study. The scriptorium and library were central to this scholarly pursuit. Imagine a grand, perhaps somewhat austere room within the abbey complex, designed for serious study. Tall arched windows would provide ample natural light, essential for the meticulous work of copying. The air would be quiet, broken only by the scratching of quills on parchment, the rustle of turning pages, and the occasional cough of a monk. The scent of beeswax, ink, and ancient vellum would hang heavy in the air. The books were not just stored, they were living tools for theological study, liturgical practice, and the broader intellectual life of the monastic community. Cluny's influence was so vast that its library not only served its own monks, but also provided a model and sometimes copies of texts for its daughter houses, effectively disseminating intellectual standards across a wide geographical area. The Cluny Library was primarily focused on theological texts, as befitted a major monastic center. Multiple copies of the Bible, along with extensive commentaries from the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, Ambrose, formed the core of the collection. The liturgical books necessary for the elaborate and beautiful worship services that were a hallmark of Cluny were also a significant component. These included antiphanaries, graduals, and missals, often beautifully illuminated and transcribed. The works of influential theologians and spiritual writers, such as Gregory the Great's Moralia in Job, or the works of Anselm of Canterbury, would have been present. Canon law texts, collections of papal decrees, and documents related to the Cluniac order's unique structure and privileges were also crucial for its administrative and political functions. However, Cluny also had a notable collection of classical works, reflecting a broader intellectual interest that extended beyond purely religious texts. Copies of Virgil, Horace, Livy, and Cicero were carefully preserved and studied. These Latin authors were valued for their literary style, their historical narratives, and their moral teachings, which could be integrated into a Christian worldview. Works on grammar, rhetoric, and logic, foundational to the liberal arts, were also present, allowing monks to develop the skills necessary for theological debate and effective communication. Historical chronicles, both universal and those specific to the Cluniac order or local regions, also filled the shelves, providing a record of the past and a context for their own times. The acquisition of books for the Cluny Library was a continuous process. Monks in the scriptorium would meticulously copy texts by hand, sometimes from older, decaying manuscripts, other times from texts borrowed from other monasteries or cathedrals. Donations from wealthy patrons, often noble families who supported the abbey, were another significant source. Some monks, upon entering the order, would bring their personal collections of books with them. The abbots of Cluny, particularly figures like Odo, Odilo, and Hugh, were strong patrons of learning and actively encouraged the expansion and preservation of the library. They recognized that a robust library was essential for maintaining the intellectual rigor and spiritual depth of the Cluniac order, whose reputation for piety and learning attracted many vocations. The Cluny Library had an immense impact on the intellectual and spiritual life of the High Middle Ages. It fostered a culture of meticulous scholarship, particularly in the study of scripture and patristic texts, which influenced theological thought throughout Europe. Its emphasis on a strict, well-ordered monastic life, supported by intellectual discipline, spread throughout the vast Cluniac network. The abbey became a center for the production of high-quality manuscripts, influencing scribal practices and artistic styles in illumination. Moreover, Cluny played a crucial role in church reform movements of the 10th and 11th centuries, advocating for greater papal authority and a purer spiritual life. The arguments for these reforms were often rooted in the theological and legal texts, preserved and studied in its library. Scholars from across Europe would visit Cluny, drawn by its reputation for sanctity and learning, sometimes to consult its unique collection. The decline of Cluny's immense power began in the 12th century with the rise of newer monastic orders, like the Cistercians, who often criticized Cluny's wealth and grandeur. Despite this, the abbey and its library continued to function for centuries. However, the French Revolution in the late 18th century proved to be its ultimate downfall. Like many other monastic institutions, Cluny was suppressed, its vast properties confiscated, and its magnificent buildings largely destroyed. The library collection was dispersed. Some manuscripts were tragically lost, while others were transferred to various public libraries in France, most notably the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and municipal libraries in regional centers like Lyon and Cluny itself. While the physical structure of the once mighty abbey lies largely in ruins today, the surviving manuscripts from its library continue to provide invaluable insights into the intellectual spiritual and are testament to the enduring power of its monastic scholars. Number 8. The Library of St. Gall. Nestled in the picturesque landscape of what is now Switzerland, the Abbey of St. Gall stands as one of the oldest and most important monastic foundations of early medieval Europe. Founded in the early 8th century around the Hermitage of St. Gall, an Irish missionary, the abbey quickly grew into a powerful intellectual and cultural center. Its library, in particular, became a renowned repository of knowledge during a period when much of Western Europe was still recovering from the collapse of the Roman Empire and grappling with widespread illiteracy. The Abbey of St. Gall's library was not just a collection of books. It was a vibrant scriptorium, a school, and a living testament to the enduring power of monastic scholarship in preserving and advancing learning. The monastic rule, like the Benedictine rule which St. Gall adopted, emphasized the importance of spiritual reading, lectio divina, and study requiring monks to engage with texts. This intellectual discipline naturally led to the establishment and growth of a library. Imagine a quiet, perhaps somewhat Spartan room within the monastic complex, where the main sounds were the scratching of quills on parchment, the rustle of vellum leaves, and the occasional low hum of a monk reciting scripture. The air would carry the distinct scent of old manuscripts, ink, and perhaps the faint aroma of freshly prepared parchment. Light would filter through small, perhaps unglazed windows, casting a soft glow on the work tables. The monks, dedicated to their tasks, saw the copying of books as a form of prayer, a sacred duty to preserve divine and human wisdom for future generations. Collection at St. Gall, particularly from the 8th to the 10th centuries, became exceptionally rich and diverse. Its core, as in all monastic libraries, consisted of theological texts, multiple versions of the Bible, commentaries on Scripture by the Church Fathers, like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. Liturgical books and theological treatises were meticulously copied and studied. The works of early medieval thinkers, such as Bede the Venerable and Alcuin of York, both influential figures in the Carolingian Renaissance, also found a prominent place. But St. Gall was also remarkable for its extensive collection of secular works. It actively collected and copied classical Latin authors like Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Cicero, and Seneca. These texts were not simply stored, they were read, studied, and often annotated by the monks, demonstrating a keen intellectual engagement with the pagan past. Beyond literature and philosophy, St. Gall's library also housed a significant number of scientific and technical texts. Treatises on medicine, often drawing from ancient Greek and Roman sources, were part of the collection, reflecting practical interests in healing and health. Astronomical works, including those on the calculation of the calendar, computus, were crucial for determining the dates of movable feasts, like Easter. Botanical texts describing plants and their medicinal properties were also present. The library even held works on grammar, rhetoric, and arithmetic, the foundational subjects of the liberal arts, which were taught in the monastic school. This broad range of subjects indicates that St. Gall was not an isolated intellectual island, but a center engaged with the full spectrum of medieval knowledge. The acquisition of books for the St. Gall Library was a multifaceted process. Primary method was internal copying within the scriptorium, where monks painstakingly reproduced existing manuscripts. They also actively borrowed texts from other monasteries or cathedrals to copy, demonstrating a network of intellectual exchange. Donations from wealthy patrons, including emperors and local nobility, also contributed to the library's growth. Habits like Grimald, 9th century, and Salomon III, 9th-10th century, were particularly zealous in expanding the collection, commissioning new copies, and attracting talented scribes. The famous Plan of St. Gall, a unique 9th century architectural drawing of an ideal monastic complex, includes a detailed layout of the scriptorium and library, underscoring their importance within the abbey's design and daily life. Many influential scholars either worked at St. Gall or were profoundly influenced by its collection. Knocker the Stammerer, 9th–10th century, a monk at St. Gall, was a renowned poet, musician, and hymnographer who drew on the rich liturgical and theological resources of the library. Eckhard IV, 11th century, another monk, chronicled the abbey's history and contributed to its literary output. These scholars, and many others whose names are now lost, made St. Gall a vibrant intellectual community. The library's extensive collection of classical texts meant that scholars at St. Gall had access to a wealth of knowledge that was often scarce elsewhere in Europe, contributing significantly to the cultural and intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The Abbey of St. Gall's library had a profound and lasting impact. It played a pivotal role in preserving classical Latin literature during a period of decline in Western literacy. The manuscripts copied and preserved at St. Gall became foundational texts for subsequent generations of scholars. The monastic school, drawing directly from the library's resources, trained generations of scribes, scholars, and churchmen who went on to spread learning throughout Europe. The high quality of its manuscripts, both in terms of textual accuracy and artistic illumination, set standards for scribal production. Its influence extended to the broader intellectual landscape, contributing to the development of early medieval scholarship and the dissemination of knowledge across the Carolingian Empire. The abbey's location also made it a crossroads for intellectual exchange, attracting scholars and texts from various regions. Remarkably, the Abbey of St. Gall Library, unlike many others, has largely survived to the present day. While its original buildings have seen changes and reconstructions, the library collection itself has remained largely intact. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, still housed in its borough hall, shooting its incredible medieval manuscripts. The manuscripts, though no longer in active daily use by monks in the same way, are carefully preserved and continue to be studied by scholars from around the world. The library's survival, a testament to its monastic custodians, allows us a direct window into the intellectual world of the early Middle Ages, making it an invaluable resource for understanding the foundations of European culture. Its unbroken line of preservation stands as a remarkable achievement in the history of libraries. Number 9. The Library of Al-Qarawiyyin, Fez. Fez, a bustling city in Morocco, stood as a vibrant intellectual and spiritual hub in North Africa during the medieval period. Within its labyrinthine streets, lined with tanneries, souks, and mosques, one institution shone particularly bright: the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded in 859 CE by Fatima al-Fihri, a wealthy and devout Muslim woman. This institution is widely considered one of the oldest continually operating universities in the world, predating many European universities by centuries. Central to its enduring legacy and its function as a center of learning was its magnificent library. The Library of Al-Qarawiyyin was not just a collection of books. It was a beacon of knowledge, a repository of Islamic scholarship, and a testament to the intellectual achievements of the Maghreb and beyond. The library was built and expanded over centuries, serving the needs of the university's students, scholars, and the broader intellectual community of Fez. Imagine a stately hall, perhaps with intricately carved wooden ceilings and cool tiled floors, designed to protect precious manuscripts from the North African climate. The air would be filled with the subtle scent of old paper, leather bindings, and perhaps the faint aroma of incense from the nearby mosque. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows would illuminate the calligraphic beauty of the manuscripts. Unlike European monastic libraries where books might be chained, Here the approach reflected a different tradition of access and trust, with books carefully stored and retrieved by librarians. Continuous operation of the university meant that the library was a dynamic, living institution, constantly acquiring new texts and serving an active academic community. Collection of Al-Qarawiyyin was overwhelmingly focused on Islamic sciences and Arabic scholarship. Multiple copies of the Quran, revered for their beautiful calligraphy and careful transcription, formed the heart of the collection. Extensive commentaries on the Quran, tafsir, vast collections of hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, and voluminous works on Islamic law, fiqh, from various schools of thought were central to the curriculum and scholarship. The library also housed a rich collection of texts on Arabic grammar, linguistics, rhetoric, and poetry, essential for understanding the nuances of the Arabic language, the language of the Quran, and scholarship. The works of influential Islamic philosophers, theologians, and mystics, such as Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, were also present, reflecting the vibrant intellectual debates within the Islamic world. However, the library's collection extended beyond purely religious texts. It contained important works on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, often drawing on both Islamic and translated Greek sources. Scholars at Al-Qarawiyyin engaged with the works of figures like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, pushing the boundaries of scientific knowledge. Historical chronicles, geographical treatises, and works on logic and ethics also enriched the collection. The university and its library were a nexus for intellectual exchange, drawing scholars from across North Africa, Al-Andalus, the Islamic Spain, and even further east, contributing to a rich tapestry of knowledge. The books themselves were often beautifully illuminated with intricate geometric patterns, floral motifs, and exquisite calligraphy, turning them into works of art. The acquisition of books for Al-Qarawiyyin's library was a continuous process of donation and purchase. Wealthy patrons, scholars, and rulers often bequeathed their personal collections to the university upon their death. Copies of important texts were also commissioned from skilled scribes. Fez was a major center for book production, benefiting from the widespread use of paper, a technology introduced to the Islamic world centuries before it became common in Europe. This made book production more efficient and less costly than the parchment-based production in the West, allowing for larger and more diverse collections. The librarians, often scholars themselves, were meticulous in their cataloging and preservation efforts, ensuring the longevity of the precious manuscripts. Many influential scholars and students were associated with the University of Al-Qarawiyyin and its library. The renowned polymath Ibn Khaldun, considered one of the fathers of sociology and historiography, studied at Al-Qarawiyyin in the 14th century, undoubtedly drawing on its vast resources for his groundbreaking work, the Muqaddimah. The Sufi, mystic, and philosopher Ibn Arabi also spent time in Fez, influenced by its intellectual environment. These scholars, and countless others, found a rich intellectual home and a comprehensive resource in the Al-Qarawiyyin library, enabling them to pursue their studies and contribute to the advancement of knowledge in various fields. The impact of Al-Qarawiyyin and its library was immense. It served as a major educational and intellectual center for North Africa and the wider Islamic world, training generations of scholars, judges, jurists, and administrators. It played a crucial role in preserving and disseminating Islamic knowledge, particularly the Maliki school of Islamic law, which is predominant in North Africa. The library's extensive collection of scientific and philosophical texts contributed to the ongoing advancements in these fields within the Islamic world. Furthermore, as a bridge between the Islamic West, Al-Andalus and North Africa, and the broader Islamic East, Al-Qarawiyyin facilitated the exchange of ideas and texts across the Muslim world. Continuous operation for over 1,000 years demonstrates the enduring commitment to learning that characterized medieval Islamic civilization. Remarkably, the Library of Al-Qarawiyyin has survived to the present day, still functioning as an active library with many of its original medieval manuscripts intact. In recent years, it has undergone extensive renovation and modernization, allowing for better preservation and public access to its historical treasures. Its collection includes rare texts such as an original copy of the Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, a 9th century Quran written in Kufic script, and a manuscript of the Al-Muwatta of Malik, a foundational text of Islamic law dating back to the 12th century. Continuous existence and active preservation of the Al-Qarawiyyin Library offer a direct window into the vibrant intellectual life of medieval North Africa and the broader Islamic Golden Age, standing as a living testament to the power of education